All right. Well, welcome everybody as you're kind of making your way to some seats or just hanging out on the second floor. If you don't know me by now, hopefully you do, but if you haven't been to one of the graduate lectures, I'm Julie Larson, the graduate chair. And I'm here to welcome Barry Wark for our second lecture for our design research workshop series. And I'm going to introduce him in a moment. But first, I just want to say a few words. So first, just some acknowledgements. We would like to offer the university's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect to the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. I would also like to thank the School of Architecture for sponsoring tonight's events, particularly, of course, Dean Michael Speaks, Associate Dean Kyle Miller, as well as all of our staff who are always doing an amazing, amazing job for us every time. All right, so tonight's event, as I said, is part of our graduate program design research workshop series. We do a series every year. Really to support new and innovative and very exciting design research that is out there in the world and bringing that into Slocum. It's really to help the graduate students start to get some exposure to guest critics doing, as I said, innovative research and bring them to Syracuse to do a public lecture and a workshop with them. So Barry is joining us, and he is the second of the three. If you didn't see last semester, for example, Sumin Ham from USC came here and did the pavilion with the students. And we have another workshop after Barry's, which is Hyojin Kwan, and you'll be hearing about that later. So this year's workshops, just so you have a little bit of insight, they're providing a kind of insight into new research methodologies and how they start to provide leverage into really what is very emerging processes and practices out beyond the walls of Slocum. So the theme of this year's workshop is generative entanglements, exploring the radical disruption of architectural norms, which engages a spectrum, quite a range, of generative workflows from all three of the guest instructors that really confront pressing questions of architecture today. How can architects remain agile, critically adaptive, and materially fluent amid technological shifts and radically disrupt traditional modes of making? But today, I am here to talk about the work. We're here to present Barry Wark's work, and I'm very excited to have him here today. He is an architect and designer known for his work in redefining what it means to think about environmental architecture in the age of ecological awareness. He has taught and held academic appointments internationally, including UPenn here, the Bartlett, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, Texas A&M, Oxford Brookes University, and the AA. And he's a frequent invited lecturer and critic at many schools of architecture worldwide. His work has been widely published in Frame, Design, Vanity Fair, and Stir, and exhibited internationally, including the Dubai Museum of the Future and the Venice Biennale. Barry is born in Scotland and now based in New York. His practice is shaped by early familiarity with buildings as artifacts that age, stain, erode, and change, and formed as much by climate and use as by design intent. His work treats architecture not as a fixed object, but as something that is continuously altered by its environment over time. Across his projects, his work is recognized for material and spatial qualities that resist clear distinction between what is made and what emerges over time. Buildings, objects, and assemblies that he shows you today are designed to register climate, exposure, and use, promoting the display of processes such as weathering, accumulation, and decay, which is very much, I think, in line with what you're going to see from the workshop and the review coming up on Monday. So this approach produces architecture that really starts to situate aesthetics as central to the design of environmental architecture and supported by circular material strategies and computational intelligence. And I have to say that the intelligence is ever present in the kind of provocative and speculative work of Barry's, and I'm very inspired and excited to have him here, and hope all of you are as well. Hopefully we can see some really amazing work today, and I just want you all to join me in welcoming Barry Wark.
Oh, okay, I'm on. Julie, thanks so much for the introduction. These introductions are always much better than anything you can say about yourself. And like Julie said, because it's so cold outside, we had a call at the start of the week when the storm was coming, and she said, can you do a 3-hour lecture? I said, why don't we make it a 4-hour lecture? So I hope everyone's well fed and watered, yeah? It's only going to be 50 minutes, don't worry, I'm just having a laugh. Okay, so as Julie said, I'm from Scotland, so these like crap jokes at the start are an opportunity for you to try and tune in to my accent, yeah? And I do a few things with my time. One thing is that I am a teacher, so I point at things, I look at the Gen Z stare, which you all are giving me right now. I also have a practice. We are building, and these projects are starting to emerge, and I'm looking forward to sharing this work pretty soon. But really what I'm going to talk about today is what is known in the US as the project. So these are the kind of ideas that motivate and transcend all individual pieces of work. It's the kind of greater thinking around what I do. And for me, this is a kind of lifelong exploration that is always sort of growing and evolving through a restless pursuit. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is I'm going to do two things. I'm going to give you a sort of a soup almost of references and ideas and themes that run through the work. And then I'm going to go through some projects where you can maybe pinpoint some of those ideas in the presentation of buildings. So my work is really motivated by the Anthropocene. I'm not using that term as an alleged geological epoch. I'm using it as a term in some way to summarize the cultural change that we're all experiencing right now in terms of how humans respond, relate to, or see themselves in relation to the environment. So for me, I'm using the term Anthropocene as a way to encapsulate that cultural change. And essentially, we're really experiencing a shift in how we exist. And one of those shifts is that the cultural construct of nature, i.e. something that exists outside of us in our artifacts in the distance, that distance that we created through that concept is collapsing through things like extreme weather, etc. This is not going to be a philosophy lecture, so don't stress too much. But what this shift essentially is that we're moving through different ontologies from anthropocentric to ecocentric. I think in the middle you have biocentrism. This is where we're a bit stuck in architecture in general, the idea that only biology or plants matter. I think that still influences the aesthetics. But really where we're moving to is this idea of ecocentrism. So the idea that washing machines and oil and weather is as important to an environmental project as plants, for example. So this, I'm going to do a couple of like bullet statements. The first one is that nature doesn't exist. Okay, so I will avoid using that word at all costs in academia. You're not allowed to use that word at the workshop this weekend. And as I say, it's a kind of cultural construct. It's an othering of objects in the world. And really what we need to do is not think about the separation, but think about the connectedness of things. So that's why we don't talk about nature. I did that too quick. But obviously thinking about ideas like ecology and humanity, it's really, really difficult. It's so complex and so vast in relation to us as humans that we can never fully grasp them. And this is what the philosopher Timothy Morton calls hyperobjects. So fast moves, okay. But yet, we can think about the complexities of ecology in really meaningful ways. So in these two cartoons, the one on the left, I can very easily think about geological timescales through a cartoon without thinking about the entirety of geology. And then the diagram on the right is how the tectonic plates create continents and countries. So in that diagram, I can begin to question, does France exist? Does America exist? And are the categories in which we have defined the world, is that appropriate culturally today? The next one is that all architecture is ecological, but not all architecture is ecocentric. So what I mean by that is that all buildings, regardless of what they claim, are connected to environment. However, this fact is not always celebrated or acknowledged. And we have spent a lot of time trying to almost mask these histories. For those of you who don't know, this is Stonehenge. All the blocks were on the ground, and the Victorians poured concrete foundations and rebuilt them, almost to create an image that humanity was impervious to time and the environment. This is not purely, exists only in Western contexts, although probably this has been dug out by Western ideologies, but this is really happening globally. And how is this manifesting sort of in architectural practice today? Hopefully everyone here knows this building. It's Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier. And in some ways, it still represents our relationship to the environment. There's a perfect white box elevated from quote unquote nature on a manicured lawn, which is effectively an ecological desert. But regardless of the ontological claims of this architect, whether the building is a machine or something else, it cannot resist falling into ruin and displaying its connection to environment. And so I think today the aesthetics and the qualities of the environmental project in architecture are not necessarily much better than that. Firstly, a lot of this work flies under the banner of cliches such as bringing nature back into the city, which is that weird paradox because, like I said, nature is a distancing term, so you're bringing it back. It's kind of weird. As well as other tropes. But the other thing for me is that I really believe that this biocentric, nature-based design, it actually forms a kind of anesthesia and a kind of pacification to the magnitude of the environmental crisis. It presents a sort of like a sweetness that somehow everything's going to be okay if we just put some plants on our buildings and we go back to a Garden of Eden utopia. But humanity has become such an intense geoforce that I don't know if that's possible anymore. And so maybe actually ecological architecture needs new sensibilities. And for me, if it is to encompass all the matter on the planet, inherent in ecocentrism, it should be much more inspired by things like atmosphere, climate, ground, and the vibrant enmeshment of all things. And for me, it's really this sense of matter being formulated into buildings, those materials being affected by the various agents that comprise biomes, and buildings being broken back down again into matter. And really what I'm striving for is what I call the humble artifact. So it's one that doesn't claim to be separate or privileged from all the other matter on the planet. It recognizes its interconnectedness. But also, I think in the time of the Anthropocene, it tries to strive for qualities of ambiguity, and you'll hear me use that word quite a lot in the presentation. And why is ambiguity important? Well, we exist on a planet that's totally indifferent to our presence, but we're constantly being told that we're a massive problem for the planet. And also, how do we start to create these boundaries between what is natural and what is artifactual? So actually, this kind of ambiguous territory of ontology, of categorization, for me is an important aesthetic quality of ecology today. And so in this vein, my work is really trying to explore new aesthetics for the environmental project in architecture, aesthetics driven by this idea of interconnectedness associated with ecology instead of the separation of nature. And really what I'm trying to do is strive for different ways of experiencing architecture and asking about how they might have both the register of artifact and the register of natural, but ambiguously exploring how these qualities might have emerged in the objects themselves. The next one that I'll put down here is that we've had a lot of chit-chat, normally in academia, about everyone talking about quote-unquote non-humans, right? I don't really know what that means, like non-human space. I don't know if it's like a rat casino at the bottom or a cockroach castle on the facade. I don't know what that means. So for me, I'd much rather talk about something that's much more disciplinary, which is talk about weathering, which has a very clear history through architecture. And so in my work, I really look at weathering as a positive quality. It's not something to be designed out of architecture. And for me, this is a way to really express that the kind of connection with the environment is not something that we can always control or we should control through highly maintained planting, but it's just a pure expression of its interaction with the biome. And I am calling for qualities of ruination within our buildings, maybe not everywhere, which I'll touch on in a second. But ruins are really powerful. They make us think about the vulnerability of buildings and by extension ourselves. So we resonate with the kind of collapse of how we resonate with these objects. But that's exactly why I'm interested in them, because they're fantastic tools to undermine the human sense of privilege, the human hubris, which has put us in large part this environmental crisis. But that said, it's essential at the same time that buildings avoid trending solely towards ruin. We cannot undermine the fundamental purpose of architecture, which is to provide shelter, right? And it's like most raw sense. And so for me, a lot of the work is asking about questions of permissibility. So what we might look at on the left and even begin to categorize as patina or patina, depending on how you pronounce it, we might view this as beautiful and acceptable. I would challenge you all to spend the night in the bedroom on the right-hand side. So this is a big part of that project. The next thing, which is coming out of larger trajectories in architecture that I don't have time to touch upon today, but is also considering architecture as assembly of parts. So rather than trying to design a building as a complete whole or an object that is finished in its initial construction, I like to try and conceive buildings as open forms, and they're really designed to have parts added and taken away. Like, I'm not precious about that at all. And what this does is it actually introduces the potential for some areas in the assemblies to be brand new and some to be weathered and old. So this also contributes and can create this further destabilization and its ambiguity. So is it under construction or is it a ruin? It's both simultaneously. So this transforms the reading of the architecture from just trending solely towards ruin to one of regeneration and circularity. Another really positive thing about working with parts is that you get this condition called the urban cliff hypothesis. It's a very dumb thing that says that cliffs and buildings have the same habitat templates, but without designing really expensive irrigation systems, vegetation just grows in the gaps. You just need the right wind direction and some water in there, and you kind of, and the material, and then you get this going. I love showing this one in the US. This is the best growing surface. You create one big, large, hard surface, and all the water and the seeds get trapped in it, and it would create a beautiful garden. But I'm sure Eisenman didn't plan that. And so the work really explores these qualities through weathering, the urban cliff hypothesis, and through a variety of these conditions. So I'm really trying to design structures with textural zones where seeds and water can get trapped for vegetal growth, as well as creating these canvases for the display of staining and other climatic factors to become apparent and displayed. And this is the kind of territory that we're going to be working in this weekend with you guys that are in the workshop. And really, sorry, I'm doing really bad microphone things here. I'm just going to go with this. And so I'm really striving to create these highly textural assemblies of parts that allow the qualities of weathering, but also that it's not a precious defined whole, that we can take pieces in and out and subtract and add them over time. So that's the kind of the soup of ideas, some of the themes, and now we can sort of see this coming to the fore through some projects. So the first project that I'm going to show is the Glasgow School of Art project. For those of you that don't know, it was, well, / is, there's another ambiguity. It was an art school designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh in Glasgow, and had a small fire in 2014 and then a larger one in 2018. And essentially it devastated not only that very significant building, but the whole block. And so what I wanted to do was offer a provocation and a vision for that building that could act as a catalyst for some bigger thinking around the site. And from a young age, what Julie touched upon, I was always inspired by this kind of material, ornamental qualities of traditional Glasgow architecture. And especially how when you look really closely, you can see these sort of microecologies that definitely unplanned existing within that work. So the first thing that I did was just to say, look, the original building is a ruin. Let's just hollow it out and create a new public space that the city needs. And the second thing was to append that building with new studio spaces. And I wanted to create this tension between age and ruination by creating an architecture on the south that would accelerate its weathering quicker than the ruined Glasgow School of Art. And so as you move outside, the extension isn't trying to play any games by mimicking or defining itself to that original building. It kind of possesses its own qualities. And we can see here from the bottom of the hill that it's becoming stained and overgrown with vegetation, and its depth and its program might not become immediately obvious. But then as we cut this in section, you begin to see the thick pochés, as well as the studio spaces and the atriums that run through to let light in, but also how through these atriums you're starting to get the same facade conditions into this folded geometries that are making up the kind of capping pieces. The other thing that I really wanted to do here was work in the territory a little bit of the uncanny as part of this kind of notion of destabilization. So in Glasgow, the city centre is a grid. So it means that you always experience the facades on the oblique. So you never actually register windows. It's always this kind of textural mass. So here, the textural mass of this building is in some ways, again, between artifact and natural in its registers and in its form. And you can see here, again, if you move around to the other side of the model, that in the oblique, you don't maybe register the balconies and the windows, but when it becomes more elevational, they become more apparent. And this is a kind of view of the entrance lobby down at the base, which again is kind of conceived as public space for the university. One of the really important things I encourage you all to do is to get out there and put your work in the world. And I always read this quote out, it's the best piece of writing ever about my work. This fills me with extreme dread and activates my fight or flight mechanisms. Terrible things happen in there. It is ever shifting, is nothing but evil intentions. I have heard of people getting swallowed by its monstrous tumoral facade and never seen again. Its aura permeates the city like a poison. I feel unsafe just looking at it. So, I mean, if you had to summarize how I feel about ecology and environment, it's literally that. So maybe there's something at work here that's quite productive. So this idea about generating an image of an architecture that breaks this kind of anesthesia of the greenwashing, maybe the aesthetic registers of this project are starting to chime into that. The next project is called House by the Sea. This one I was really inspired by the audacity of painting a building white in the harshest environments, one of the harshest ones that we live in, and expecting it to kind of stay white. So this one does have sound, but I don't think it's popping off. Oh, there we go. We've got a seagull at the end. And so building on these themes, the house is again in this uncanny, strangely familiar territory. It has qualities and registers of domesticity through the pitch, but also those of the landscape in which it's situated. But then as we get closer, we can almost begin to see that it's an assembly of blocks and seams with material changes and maybe different colors in the blocks in themselves. And what I wanted to do here was work with a piece of architecture that has 3 core parts to the house that are permanent, but then has more faster replaceable parts that would then sit on top of that in almost a quite ramshackle way that isn't precious. So then again, if we see the 2 short elevations, we get the kind of register of domesticity, but then in the long elevation, we read it as an open form where we can take parts in and out, and it wouldn't necessarily affect the composition of the architecture. But the way that this is designed is it's really designed to create these deep textural areas where the effects of climate can take hold. So the idea here is almost that the building is unpaintable. You can't even clean it because it's so textured and deep and pochade. And then if you want to do like a little bit of architecture, because, you know, that's what we're meant to be doing here, really it's a simple move and plan. You take the kind of profile of the domestic house, and then by rotating the human spaces on the inside, you then get the interstitial zones that are much more ambiguous, still encapsulated within the kind of profile of the house. And you can see that the outside is highly textured, but then as we cut through the interior, it starts to become almost like these rock-cut faces that are incredibly smooth as if sliced through that mass. And so again, this is another project that's trying to push against the kind of sweetness of that architecture-nature dialogue. So instead, it's trying to really think about the wider actors that are as part of this biome. So yeah, seagulls, crabs, whatever else might be here. And again, trying to move from these aesthetics of nature to ecology, so this kind of interconnectedness. The next project is called Printed Parts. And this project is really exploring the position that buildings and their elements should be able to be reappropriated and recycled into new elements to meet the needs of a circular and or ecological architecture. So a lot of my work has been engaging with 3D printing. And why should we do that, or why is that interesting? Well, I think for me, architecture has always been accelerated or new possibilities brought to the fore through technology and construction. If we think about how cast iron created these large spans, or steel of the elevator created the high rise, it radically changes things. So in a lot of my work, I speculate on what 3D printing could do for future architectures. But one of the things about 3D printing is that quite often, depending on who you talk to and the technology, is that you can make parts and you can grind them down and just reprint again. There's a big conversation about binders that I always get asked at lectures. Don't ask me. Another thing that I wanted to explore in this project was about, you know, a sense of the megalithic, that actually we can make large parts again using this. We don't have to deal with the sort of the micro world of other construction components. But also the idea that if the parts weren't ground down after use, that you could almost get this kind of loose-fitting reassembly. So this image on the right is from Paris Fort, where you can see that the columns have been sort of chopped and flipped on the side to make a new facade. And the other part of 3D printing that's really interesting is what it does is it gives architects agency again, or maybe for the first time, to really design material conditions at the scale of things like moss and ecology. And we, through computation and printing, can control where we would get water retention or allow it to run off. So I started this project working with a kind of packing logic, but rather than have modular parts, I wanted to almost create what I call like amalgamated parts that could loosely fit together. So you can see here within an assembly that the legibility of those parts might be quite opaque, but nonetheless they have these like fissures that run through that would allow water to percolate through the object to create plant propagation. And this is a kind of old hat, but also the idea that working with 3D printing, we can take every single piece and optimize it towards either structural, aesthetic, or material objectives. And so these parts, again, you can optimize them for handling. So each part can be like a one-man lift or one-woman lift. I'm not being sexist, it's just a term of phrase. And also that every single part in itself is not explicit to its orientation. Every single orientation has its own way or its own qualities regardless of how it's rotated. So you can see in this picture here, close up, you can see the seams and the fissures and the textures where moss, flora, and insects could begin to colonize the structure if it was to be left outside in the correct orientations. And so here, this is like a small animation of some of these parts, a little lag there, joined together into a structure where you can start to see some of these fissures and textures over the top. And the idea is here that these would be vaulted, probably have to be a little bit of post-tension in some of these. But these amalgamated parts, the idea that it can interlock even as it does some of this vaulting. And the idea is in some of the textures, that some of the textures are very sharp as if they're brand new, whereas others are more eroded. So again, this kind of legibility of new and old and what is ruinous and what is recently installed becomes obfuscated through the kind of entire assembly. And so this is obviously a render. It's not like built this big yet, but you know, the next Venice Biennale can call me or something. This one's called House by the Desert. Again, imagining a piece of architecture in a different biome. So this one has some music, so I'll just let this run a little bit. So again, the project here is, again, trying to find new aesthetics for what a desert house might be beyond maybe like sand dunes or maybe some of the other tropes that we know. And again, it's operating between this legibility of where are these materials or where are these registers coming from, again, between this artifact and natural. And the way that the project is formed, let's say, like it's kind of its morphological genesis, do we even say that in architecture anymore? It's effectively like a box, And then what happens is that the rocks that are in the context, which are down to the bottom left of the image, the shadows from that context then carve out the interstitial spaces through and into that box. But the other thing that we start to see here is that the architecture not only in some ways has the registers of the context in which it's situated, but also the kind of processes that have been used to generate that form. So we start to almost register this recursiveness that's happening as part of the simulation that's used to create the volume. So the south elevation is on the top. This becomes like a entirely opaque box that doesn't get any direct light. And then on the north side, we get almost like a large viewing window out across the desert. The east and west have small openings for cross ventilation, but really the majority of the light in the project comes through indirectly these light wells. So I'll go past this. I'll maybe stay here because if I go too close to the speaker, it will get crazy. So it's a really actually pretty small house in terms of the enclosure, but the space that is occupied by the building creates these external spaces that are not prescriptive in how they should be inhabited, but create this kind of landscape in and around the architecture for you to inhabit. In the atmosphere inside, again, it's becoming akin to these kind of megalithic rock-cut interiors that are very prevalent in these kind of desert regions. But you can see maybe in the kind of middle image about how this reflected, diffuse light is entering into the spaces, as well as the kind of middle top one, where you get this kind of oblique overhang that has been carved by the shadows cutting into the volume. And again, this is imagined as an assembly of 3D printed blocks and sort of quarry blocks. The idea is that you have load-bearing walls, and then you can post-tension the pieces to just simply span across those walls. So again, that's another project that's operating in the same way as the house by the sea, where it's not trying to necessarily mimic the desert or its context, but it's using the context as a tool to push up against the artifact and ask us where those boundaries or where that definition, that categorization of things might not be so obvious. This project is called Tour House. Tour is Gaelic, which is like the Scottish language for tower. And really, what I'm trying to do with this project is to really push a little bit harder some of the tectonics, the fabrication, and the environmentally sort of driven construction of the work. And one of the ways in which I'm doing that is, again, I'm imagining topics around 3D printing, around monolithic homogeneous construction. And so really what this is thinking about is that how we might build buildings in a way that can be easily recycled. One of the complexities of circular materials is that our facades are now so layered and bonded with so many different materials, to pull all of that apart is an absolute nightmare. So really what the work is doing is that the envelope, the thermal barrier, is created purely through the thickness of the material. Also using 3D printing, you can create incredibly intricate cellular or voids within that could also then be packed with a biodegradable insulation. And so, like I was saying before, the facade of the project is structurally independent from the elements inside that create the kind of spatial division. And so the interior spaces are built up of just like a very generic steel frame that can be bolted and unbolted. It has a couple of 3D printed columns at the bottom, and then it has glazing in and around that for acoustic separation. And even though this might look like a solid block, through the depths of the reveals, there's still many, many windows that let light into the center of this volume and flood it. So you can see here in the elevations of the facade, I really try to develop this quality of fracture continuity, where the form kind of allows for blocks to be taken in and out, and it wouldn't really affect the overall composition. It has this kind of rough set of rules in some way. And then when there's gaps behind, you just fix glazing in behind those voids. So in this view, you can see that all these are individual blocks, and all these blocks maximize the size of like printers that exist today, where it can just be pulled off. And I'll explain a little bit in the sections, but essentially the ground floor is a kind of kitchen area, then you go up through 2 bedrooms, and then at the top is a kind of double height space, which has the living room. So you can see here, more in this view, this is these thick 600 mil, I don't know what that is in feet, sorry, facades that then have the ornamental layer on the outside, which is designed to kind of promote the weathering that I've been talking about, and then the inside like a very lightweight construction. And the idea is that the facade can be readjusted or the inside can be readjusted without affecting each other. Then when you come on to the section the other way, you can see that the bedroom starts small and then you get a sort of larger one, the double height living space at the top with a large sliding window. But then you get this kind of void space up from the living room. And the idea is that both sides of this kitchen table, these doors fold back so you can open that out into the landscape. And again, we can see here that we're almost imagining the building when it's first built. So it is intentionally playing with registers of a kind of defensive structure in a landscape, as well as something like megalithic, like a crag, or something that's kind of erupted from the landscape. But of course, you should know me by now, 40 minutes in, that this building is also designed to weather in a really particular way. And it's trying to think about the longevity of buildings as part of its sort of questions. And so really what I was also trying to do was embed the architecture with both quick and slow weathering. So the quick weathering is that all these ledges would collect leaves, and they would be there every year and accumulate, as well as slower forms of weathering like moss and lichen, which can take decades. So it's kind of like fast and slow. But now, as the pine forest is sort of grown around the project, what I'm proposing here is that the qualities of like deep weathering that would exist on such a structure would become permissible, or more permissible, if you remember our barn from a little while ago. I'm arguing that the weathering feels more permissible because of the perceived solidity and the anachronistic ancient language that's part of this. So anachronistic just means that it doesn't have a kind of clear timestamp. So this, in conjunction with these like fractured continuity that undermine the perfection of the building from day one, what I'm sort of saying is like, guys, it's never been perfect. Don't worry about it getting dirty. It's already chipped. Just chop and change this thing as you need to. And then if we can do a little bit of architecture again. You enter up from the top left, and then you kind of come down a set of stairs into this kitchen area, and then you can see the doors opening top and bottom above the dining table. This is this kind of printed column which acts as a prop. Then as you kind of come up the staircase, you can pass the 2 bedrooms. You can see that some of the walls are solid and some of them are actually very thin and open. And then you emerge out the top of that journey. So as you come up the staircase, it's all solid, and then you emerge out from there into this kind of light-filled living room where you look out across the tree canopy. And I think that one of the other things that I was working on in this project, and it was interesting that sort of Design picked up on it as one of their like top trends for 26, so maybe I'm just trendy. And as well as the kind of tectonic ideas, I was interested in producing a piece of architecture that was not the glass box in the forest, but really trying to create spaces inside here that were megalithic, calm, quiet, and enriching, that somehow that when you knock your hand against this building, it feels like something. And I think for me, that's a really important sensibility today, because I think the digital world is making us all long for something quote unquote real. So that was a few of the agendas that I was really working on when these things were coming together. This is the last project, so you can perk up and start thinking about some amazing questions. Obviously, there's normally like a tech guy. I'm looking for the tech guy. I don't think he's here. It's normally like somebody's like ready to get me. And normally he's like, can you build this stuff? So I love doing this one last. I was commissioned by the Dubai Museum of the Future to create a large installation that was trying to in some way demonstrate or speculate on the future of construction and architecture, okay? And what I wanted to do was really speculate on language or an architecture for a region that did not have any vegetation. So rather than try and do a green project in Dubai, what would an ecology project in Dubai be in some way? And again, this is building on the 3D printed research that I'd already been doing. So as one sort of approaches the wall at a glance, it might appear as if this is like something natural, as if maybe it's like been cut from the desert. But then as a kind of second look, perhaps you start to register datums or the kind of two material systems that are being, two algorithmic systems that are being employed. But then, has it been arranged? When did this happen? It feels eroded and soft. So really what I'm trying to do is I'm using form, I'm using aesthetics to not make something that's entirely legible at the first moment that it's looked at. And then as we get closer, do we start to see the legibility of the parts that is in the assembly? Or is that assembly obfuscated by an intense array of detail and pattern? And do you start to read chisel lines? Or are they digital contours? So how do we begin to understand this as an object between artifact and kind of natural? And as it draws us in further and further and further, we even begin to see new details emerging through the kind of traces of the processes that were used to create it. And in this project, I really wanted to like, it's a cliche, but you know, you always want to like kill your heroes. So I always had great admiration for a guy called Michael Hansmeyer and Benjamin Dillenberger, and they 3D printed this grotto, but so much of it was flat. And I was like, what a waste of 3D printing. So I was like, I'm gonna take every square centimeter of this thing and I'm gonna go in. So as you zoom and zoom and zoom, each of the colorful objects or illustrations on the right is times two, times two, times two, more and more details emerge that you wouldn't see in the first glance. But I am working here a lot with algorithms, the basis of which you will receive in the workshop this weekend if you're there. It's all done off of and built off of the things that I'm going to show you. But this in a way is really interesting because there's an incredible amount of variety, but also homogeneity across these surfaces. And this is something that we find a lot in quote-unquote natural systems. So again, that is also undermining the idea that this has been modeled or it's been made or it's an artifact once again. And one of the other things that I really wanted to do with this project was, again, not make it immediately legible as an artifact by having a grid of panels. So the other thing that I do here is create highly differentiated panels that again resists that immediate legibility of how it might be made or what it is. And so we send all these parts to the fabricator. And again, one of the most amazing or productive things is that you do all the work in the computer, which is kind of cheap compared to like when you're on site or when you have people, they're really expensive. So you integrate all the hanging system and all the numbering is all done digitally in every single part. And again, much like the printed parts project, every single part, if it were to be taken away and reused, has its own quality. Every single one of them possesses its own sort of like set of aesthetic qualities that I've tried to argue for as part of the lecture. So this is another part of that assembly, much deeper, different conditions that are governing its form. And what it means that by creating this kind of like positive jigsaw where something can only assemble and you label everything, it means that the whole wall was like fully constructed in 45 minutes. Because the panel can only positively like link and drop into the one before. So it kind of like creates this interlocking structure. And I think one of the great things for me as an architect is that this wall really raises like a lot of interesting questions. It's made from sand, it's installed, and after it's installed, it can be ground down again and be reformed or not. And it raises questions about when was this something natural when it was sand? When did it become an artifact? And can it go back to being natural again? Or is it, as soon as it's touched, it becomes some kind of synthetic new category? And for me as an architect, through installing this in a kind of public museum, I was able to engage people with those type of questions around ecology and its aesthetics. So with that, I'll say thank you. I hope you have some questions that we can go into now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for a really amazing, beautiful lecture. I want to give everybody a chance if you have some questions. Yes, Margaret.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier in your lecture, introducing your work, printed pieces. You briefly mentioned the relationship between technology and architecture, comparing 3D printing to cast iron and its impact on building. In your opinion then, was it the experimentation with new kinds of software and technology, computational design, 3D printing, that led you to this building methodology, or was it the other way around, the childhood fascination with weathering, the pursuit of the humble artifact? Did that drive you to seek the tools to realize it?
It's a good question and very astute listening and sort of observations from the lecture. I always give honest answers, and really with this, it's kind of this both and thing. I would not say that it's one thing or the other, and I would probably need to go to therapy for like 10 years with an architect-therapist hybrid to understand why we do the things that we do. Each one of you will have your own penchants and your own stories and your own histories that influence things. And how do any of us really know what is driving what? I think I feel very lucky that maybe I'm 50 years too early or 150 years too late, but I certainly have a desire and a belief that our built environment needs more elevated articulation. I don't want to use the word ornament because ornament's loaded with meaning, but let's call it articulation, beyond what the modernist project has left us with. And so for me, 3D printing, which is totally agnostic to form, is a way to actually come back to ornament and building outside of labor. And I think for me, that's a kind of really interesting potential of that material. It's also interesting in the way that it can optimize its use. So for example, if we turn around and we say something like, look, nothing's going to replace concrete, so why don't we just try and use it really efficiently? So there's lots of arguments for printing. I'm not saying that I've solved it. That's really like not my thing at all. But what I'm trying to do is say, what could happen with this and what might it offer us? So do I like ornament because I'm from Glasgow? Do I like stone and heavy things because I'm from Glasgow? Yeah, probably. But really the thing that that I'd say is most important is that when I grew up there, it rains all the time, right? Like the environment is just on you. You cannot escape this wetness. It's there all the time. And you feel that as a person, and that also is manifest in the buildings. So my sense of ecology and environment was never this kind of thing of, oh, it's so sunny, let's put some green plants on the building, it's so cute. It was like a totally different sensibility. And I think that's what I just try and exercise through my work in a kind of creative way. So probably, as usual, I didn't answer your question, but hopefully there was something in there that resembled a close enough response.
It was. Thank you. Looking forward to the lecture, and architect therapist. I think I found my new minor.
There's a lot of people here that need therapy, so if somebody wants to do that, dual degree, you'll make a lot of money.
I think we would, yeah. What else?
You seem to be very against that utopianism created by plant ecology. But these plant ecology can act very efficiently as sound barriers, air purifiers, and maybe habitats for birds. Like for instance, like Beijing, they carve the masonry buildings to make it habitable for pigeons. And so the utopianism is spreading false hope, like you said, but it can act very efficiently as function. So why are you against utopianism? And for tour house, how do you install your insulation and air barriers or vapor barriers between the walls? Like since it's like a consistent stone. And for the tour house, like when you have like curvatures that will store water, it can like fungi can grow inside of it, and like bad kind of fungi like penicillin, it can cause respiratory infections for the liver for the residents, and like yes, these are inhabitable for plants and beneficial for plants, but is it really beneficial for the residents and the human beings? And you talk about hyper-objects, which is a post-human approach, I would understand it as. So that kind of sustainability, I see it as sustainability for the planet when all humans extinct. So what's your response to how do your buildings serve to the residents instead for nature?
I know. I think you've done a classic American question where you've asked me 3 questions in one question. And now what I need to do is go back and remember all your questions as I try and answer them all. So you asked, okay. So the hyper-object thing, architects have for a long time been reading philosophy and trying to justify their project through what a philosopher has said. That's not what I'm trying to do. I read things, I look at the world, and I become inspired to reconsider how I might produce or exist as a kind of human in the planet. This idea of a humble, like a humble artifact, the idea that the thing that, like any building is going to become dust unless it's rebuilt. Any building. Venice will not exist in 1,000 years unless it is entirely rebuilt. Okay, so this kind of the reason that I reference things like Morton and hyperobjects is, okay, you can talk about the Morton philosophy. I'm saying that I'm humble, I don't matter, it's okay, that's fine. Like we need a little bit dampening of that. But then the other things from Morton is like the ecology without nature. That's obviously all the way through here as well. But at the end of the day, I'm an architect. Guess what buildings are for? People, right? So I read the philosophies, I read things, I'm inspired, but ultimately I'm still doing my stuff. I don't need that to justify what I'm doing. When I present that in a lecture, what I'm doing is trying to let you guys in a little bit to some of the things that maybe, if you think this interesting, maybe you pick that up. But that doesn't justify the project, okay? The other thing, okay, tour house. Are you taking construction classes? Okay, there's literally a book called Monolithic Homogeneous Construction. I think it's by 2 German dudes, and if they're not German, they're German adjacent, i.e. Austria or Switzerland or Liechtenstein or something, right? But that's the title of the book. Go and get the construction details from that. If I have a client that wants to pay me the fees to detail all the stone blocks, I can deal with the water runoff. Like I literally build buildings. Like, I understand that thing. The whole question around health is important. Again, I come back to this, the picture of the facade and the interior. None of that stuff's happening on the inside. It's happening on the facade of the outside. And if you pick up your phone later on and look at any Scottish castle, the facade has moss and it's weathered and people still live in them today and it's okay. Well, if you were experiencing health problems, then you could come and get the dangerous moss removed, right? If you were so stressed about it. But probably if you were a health freak in that way, you would not commission me to do this building. So let's not worry about that one. Then what was your first question? Okay, plants are good. I agree with everything you just said in that part more than the latter two. But I believe that the challenges of environment are not epistemological, they're ontological, right? So what does that mean? Our problems of environment are not about technology. It's not about food or energy or we have the technology, we could distribute and sort all that stuff out, honestly. Our problems are ontological. It's how we see ourselves existing. It's about humanity. It's about if we don't stop, in my opinion, if we don't stop certain behaviors or trajectories, we're all, I can't swear because the camera's on, but you know what the word would be, right? So I believe the challenges of environment is not about, techno-optimists, we can fix it, it's technology, more energy, more... No, it's not. It's actually about people sitting down and having a look at how they live and how do we relate to each other. So for me, one of the big challenges of environment is that we have designed out any connection with environment through the design of our cities. It's subways, it's phones, it's air conditioning, push away. How many times a day do you think about how you are connected to even your local biome? I came in the plane today and I was like, oh, whoa. I was looking for white walkers. I was like, I am in some sort of northern tundra. It's a forest, right? But seriously, right? But when I'm in the city and I come out of my air-conditioned house and I jump in my car and I put the heating on, I come into my air-conditioned building, how much am I thinking about that? And how would that affect my behavior if I had more environmental consciousness in my daily life? So am I saying that the whole city needs to be a ruin? Am I saying that the whole city needs to embody the aesthetics of the work that I'm doing here? No. But do we need more spaces and more aesthetics like this in our daily lives? Yes. So my spirit animal, I don't know if you guys are is big on them over here, is archigram. And my lineage, being a Bartlett student and then teaching there, is Peter Cook through this thing. Sometimes we need to produce architecture, not necessarily to solve problems, but to produce architecture as provocateur, to stir up, to annoy somebody. And the fact that you're annoyed about moss and mold and that you don't like what I'm saying about the plants, I'm great. I'm going to quote you in my next lecture as underneath. I'll put a list of disclaimers. But these are valid questions, but you also need to look at work and understand what it's trying to do. That's not a technical project. That's an aesthetic sort of conceptual idea about how we might build in some ways. But look at that monolithic homogeneous construction. Though you'll get some details in there that will quench your worries.
Yeah, and with all the technology today, it's funny how so many more kids than ever are allergic to peanuts. And there's statistically somewhere I read that most of the time kids that are living on a farm, they're going to do a lot better because they're actually exposed to things that I think we've stripped that away from our daily life to thinking technology is going to keep us safe and clean. And I think we're doing the opposite problem.
I mean, the craziest thing is the dirtiest thing in this room is all of you. I'm being serious. Yeah. The number one thing that's going to kill you is another COVID outbreak or something. It's not some moss on the outside of the building. So I don't know. We're all a bit turned around with what is actually clean and dirty in some ways. But c'est la vie.
What else? Who else?
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. At the start of the lecture, you had shown us a spectrum with anthropocentric, biocentric, and ecocentric. But you did one thing that was missing in that spectrum was technocentric, which is funny because you work a lot with 3D printing and things like that. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, do you think there are like lines that are blurred between technocentrism and ecocentrism, or how would you prioritize one over the other, or do you think they work together, or are there like yeah?
I understand the question. I mean, look, as a person, I'm not interested in it. One of the things of the lecture is like I'm like against categories. So I'm not here trying to say exhaustively that there's only 3 ontologies in the planet. There's many other ways that people might categorize or view that branch of philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. So I don't even know what the definition of a technocentrist might be. It sounds maybe adjacent to a techno-optimist, that somehow technology is like going to save us. I think that in ecocentrism, it's a kind of umbrella term for everything, so it would probably be like consumed in there. So that's how I would kind of answer that in some way. So that's a short answer for a change. That one's all right. There was somebody over there.
Hi, thank you. I was curious, you talked a lot about weathering. You talk about a lot about like human impacts and how we keep ecological processes at a distance. And in your projects, you're showing these like very elaborate facades of articulation. And then on the inside, it's very typical, like human scale architecture, furniture, furnishings, and electricity, all that stuff. And I'm curious, like with that in mind, like if these artifacts are meant to be weathered in a specific way, are we also keeping these ecological processes at a distance at the same time?
Because it's on the facade.
Yeah, like if it's all designed to be that way, you're still controlling it in a specific way.
No, I mean, again, it's another astute observation. It's something that I'm always getting slammed about in lectures. So, I'm glad somebody else is just like keeping the tradition going. I don't know. I mean, again, if I try and give like a very like frank answer, it's interiors and furniture and this kind of like the tactility of designing those worlds. There's a whole other profession really that does that stuff. And often when I'm doing these projects, I just set myself a time limit. And my half-joking comment about like, am I 150 years too late or 50 years too early, is because my dream would be to be somehow like Charles Rennie Mackintosh or like an Art Nouveau where I get to design the light switches, okay? But there's also something that I'm trying to do with the work, again, like just being super honest, where because so much of it is so hard for the general public to digest, I try and have these quite lucid moments where someone's like, okay, it's just a dining table and some chairs and there's a column there, okay. They can breathe a little bit. So, if it was a shop fit out that I presented, of course I'm creating a world that would exist in its kind of interior. Then to kind of expand that discourse into kind of weathering, as part of this, I guess, as an ideology that would be that somehow people would fill their homes with furniture that they would have for decades. And we would not, as a culture, have furniture that would never weather because we'd already chucked it out because we were buying things that were fashionable or cheap. But I don't really have the capacity to kind of design that stuff as much as I would love to. But in my own life, that's how I try and buy things that would act in that way and have weather. I know that I don't have like pseudo-scuffed stuff on, like clothes. But I do try and, in my own personal life, like buy things that I want to have. So maybe if you know me in 50 years, I'll have scuffed furniture, and I can show that picture in the lecture. But thanks so much for your question, super observant.
You have energy for?
I'm good. I'm yeah.
Thank you. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what you think about ambiguity. And my question kind of relates to weathering. And as you're designing it, you are like placing the spots for weathering to happen, or saying this is where the weathering would be. And I was wondering if you think that is ambiguous.
It's a topic that we'll be discussing this weekend in the workshop. I don't have the answers to this. There's a great book by David Leatherbarrow and Moshe Mustavi that talk about weathering. And one of the kind of my takeaways from that book is about this like permissibility question, right? If the weathering looks intentional, it kind of is more okay than if it feels like an accident. So what I'm trying to speculate on, and again, you might say, like, well, why don't you show us these processes or these diagrams? That's another big conversation. But what I'm speculating upon is that the buildings are going to weather regardless of what happens. But if I control the weathering, that's also part of the route towards making it permissible. But the difference is I'm not creating a facade and going, there's a plan, there's a plan, there's a plan, right? I'm creating a surface that says, seeds are going to come this way, the sun's going to hit it like that, water's going to go there, let's see what happens. It's a bit more, I can roughly say that something's going to happen, but I'm not trying to control it in that way. Does that make sense? So that's how I'm trying to approach that. But again, that's that kind of ambiguous, like, oh, should I be doing that or not? But that's part of the fun. That's part of the fun of doing the work, is asking those kind of questions.
You could make an argument that it's actually your responsibility not be thinking about it, anticipating,
I mean, yeah.
You see a lot of architects, I'll just name call, like, I've seen like NBRD's work 20 years ago, we saw, it just, and it weathered like shit, just was like not good. There was just some kind of lack of like knowledge of how those surfaces or certain materials were patina, and it was left unconsidered in a way. So it was just like, oh man, that's a disappointment. You just could tell that it just had aged in not a good way. Right?
But this is actually one of the routes into practice that I'm being a little bit subversive, where I'm trying to bring this stuff into the buildings that I'm doing by saying to clients, you don't want this to look like crap, so why don't we design certain material conditions or certain articulations that might make this look better over time. So even though this is like pie in the sky, provocative stuff, there's always things here that you can mine down into the construction of a kind of building practice today.
I saw that you compared a lot of your work to Neolithic architecture and the Stonehenge, but I also noticed that a lot of your work, the material quality and the articulation felt really, really similar to Buddhist and Hindu architecture. Like a lot of the work has this sort of pixelated, rough quality that like really reminded me of a lot of the works that we learned about in history. So I was wondering whether that influenced you in any way, or if it's maybe just kind of was in the back of your mind somehow in some way.
I mean, thanks so much for the compliment. I mean, if I could build something that somebody turned around and was like, wow, this is like a Hindu temple, I'd really won. But this is also the kind of comes back to the first question, the very, very first question about like where does this come from and what drives what? What sits in the architectural or one's subconscious? This is why we need our architectural therapists, yeah? The question about why they resonate with you, for me is like a kind of more interesting way to think about it in some way. And what I'm trying to argue for is a kind of articulation or a sort of organized complexity, a kind of, that a building has something about it that you can clearly see that it is not just about money, and it's not just about doing the least bare minimum. And generally when you see buildings that have a form of articulation on them, that's because people spent money. And I think for me, it's crazy to imagine America at a point in time where people actually used to have to like ornament or articulate their buildings because they had to be better than the one next door or the one down the road because you wanted clients to buy your flats or offices, right? And if you think about that, the Hindu temple, and think about some of the setback buildings in New York with these articulated edges, you can see how architecture, when it starts to consider material or tectonics, even globally can start to amalgamate or find synergies between forms and where do you do these different things. So again, to be a broken record, this idea of like categorization or that's that, actually this kind of like soup of things that can exist on very disparate places and influence one in the production of architecture. I think especially today with social media, blah, 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 internet, I think that's like totally on the table. So if you turn and you say to me, oh, it looks like you're inspired by Hindu temples, I'm like, okay, good, I'm on the right path. Because I think if architecture could inspire or hold such value as a building like that, pretty, for me that's operating in the right territory of where aesthetically I think our built environment should be.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about where the weathering occurs. So the mass and articulation that you've designed, like it looks like there are many different surfaces that are designed not just on the exterior of like this block mass, but also on the inside. But then if I understand the presentation correctly, it seems like the surfaces that are subject to change or weathering, are those only going to be on the facades? Or do you ever design these objects in a way that they would also weather in the interior?
Great, thanks so much for the question. On the Glasgow School of Art project, the idea was that the light wells, like, the idea that it was basically you just need to have light wells. That's kind of like one of the only ways that you can do it. And again, it comes back to this question of the permissibility of things, where I showed the facade of the barn and the interior. Architecture needs some kind of protected core. Like, you know, this guy, if he has a moldy kitchen, he's going to flip out, or in his bathroom, or where his laptop is, right? So there's always kind of like, you know, I don't really like talking about gradients. That's like another big thing that I don't have time to go into. But there needs to be like different types of space, I believe, in buildings. And one of the things that's happened through the 20th century till today is that actually the variety of spaces that make up where we live have become incredibly sort of like dichotomous. It's like you're either inside that pissed-in curtain wall or you're outside of it. And actually, some of the ways that we used to live historically would have much more ambiguity in those type of spaces, that kind of layered spaces. And we still see that in some cultures today. You know, if you think about like a riad in Morocco, they even migrate through their building between day and night and veranda and underneath in different layers. But we, in our urbanism and in our cities, particularly this kind of the globalized city, we don't have those ambiguities. I am trying to work on that. But yeah, it takes time. But I appreciate the observation and the kind of question, but I would hope that in some way the work does not convey that you're either inside the thing or outside of it. It actually has much more kind of engagement and kind of dialogue between that line.
It seems like it does have that potential because, like, if the facade does experience a severe amount of weathering, like, if you did not replace those panels or something, I guess it would just have a very different look. It would reveal the interior more
Yeah.
than the outside.
Yeah, I mean, I could go back through the plans and things, it doesn't matter, but a lot of the plans are trying to do that. But the idea is that if a panel fails, you just take it off and it doesn't like kill the building, or the water doesn't leak in some way. Like it's definitely trying to like not do that. This is one of the things that I said was that, you know, architecture can fail in its like fundamental duty to provide shelter from the environment. So that's why we always need to have that core spaces, you know.
That's cool. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It has to be the best question ever. You have to ask me a 5-part question.
It's really hard.
If you don't mention at least 4 philosophers, then terrible.
Okay, so hi. I've been following your studio work in Pennsylvania for a few years. So I was wondering, how does your studio work initiate from the very beginning, and how does that develop till the very end? And how like I kind of investigated in Houdini for, I don't know, for a week during the summer vacation, but like just don't know how does that kind of really detailed but interesting shape became like developed into an architectural project.
Mm-hmm.
How does that like being processed and being directed through your studio?
Sure. Okay, how did this? So the first thing that I want to say, just as a kind of, how am I saying this? Am I saying this as a teacher? Yeah, I am. When I was a student, it was like Rhino, and then Maya came in, and it was like, oh my God, Maya. And it's like, oh my God, Cinema 4D. And then it's like, oh my God, Houdini. And now it's like, oh my God, AI, like image to mesh generators, blah, 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 right? So even in my relatively short career as an architect, the acceleration and the differentiation of technologies and methodologies and platforms, even in this stuff, is incredibly like moving between things, right? Why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that to not get bogged down on a tool, because if you get bogged down on a tool, I promise in today's age, that tool will be obsolete in like 2 years. So don't worry about the tools, honestly. Focus on the ideas. Like, what are the ideas? Like, what do you want to say? What is it you want to put down as an architecture student? Number one. Then to actually kind of answer the question, it's great that we have like some of these like spinning, sort of spinning objects on the screen. I do sketch, and by sketch I mean I have bits of paper that open and I put a pen on them. But I also kind of call these models or sketches or something else in that territory. Designing buildings is very, very difficult because they have gravity and circulation and program and blah, 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 blah. So really, this is like a fragment of a library of these models. And the way that this works is that this can be accelerated and manipulated into architecture as I think about it. But so what I do with the students is we start by developing, they have their own little bits and pieces like that. They develop codes that then can have the plasticity to then be evolved into buildings. But really, nothing designs a building except you. So you need to have the ideas, you need to do things and direct it. There's not like a magic button in that software. So that's how I would both answer the question as a kind of direct response about what do they do, but then also like try and respond a wee bit as a kind of somebody that's a teacher and somebody who has I've watched people die on a hill by being pegged to a software. Like, don't be that person. Okay? All right. Thanks so much, everyone.